I have not seen the show. Let's just put that out there. Welcome back. Last year, I inadvertently started a project of reading the Song of Ice and Fire series. I historically wasn't big into reading fantasy books. Like growing up, I never read fantasy. I always read like historical fiction or just general fiction. I never really touched fantasy. To me, it was hard to get into fantasy because it was very intimidating. Trying to imagine things that I had never seen, or trying to imagine like how these politics are working or how these worlds are set up or whatever. That was like really intimidating to me and really hard. I really stayed away from fantasy until in my 20s, like really after college. After college, I read Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings and all of that. So I really got into it after that point, mostly because of my husband. He is a huge Lord of the Rings fan. I blame him for getting me into the fantasy scene. Last year, I really was going through a difficult time, both of us were, and I needed some escapism that was to the max. Escapism to the max, basically. Started with Game of Thrones, and I bought these editions, actually at the Ren Fair here in Arizona, so I got this whole box set, and I was like, I'm committing to it. Today I'm going to go over kind of my review of the series in general and talk about just the franchise. We're going to break it down into not by book, but by like subjects. So we're going to talk about the characters, the plot, the world building, all of that stuff. So it's kind of a unspoken rule of mine that I try to read the books before I watch any kind of adaptations. I have not seen the show. Let's just put that out there. I tried to watch it the first a couple times before I started reading it, but I didn't go too far because I was like, I want to read the books first. So usually what happens when I read a series is if there's an adaptation, I'll read the book and then watch the movie. So like, if I read the first Harry Potter book, I would go watch the first Harry Potter movie. That was my plan, was to do that with these books, because it was kind of like one season was one book. I was actually pretty surprised at how faithful the show was being to like almost scene by scene with the first book. I did finish the first season. I didn't get too far into the second season. I don't even know if I started it, to be honest. Yeah, so I finished the first season and I kind of decided that I didn't need to watch any more of it, just because throughout reading this whole series, I would ask my husband about how it was in the show because he's seen all of it. So we would kind of compare notes, and some of the things he would tell me about that didn't happen in the book at all, and I don't understand why they did it that way. It was kind of like enhancing character flaws or making things more sensational than they are in the book. There's really no reason to me. A lot of that stuff, when they do that, kind of changes the characters for me, and so then it feels inauthentic. And I don't really understand why they do that. I think you should be as faithful to the original work as possible, especially when it comes to characters, like main characters. Don't foresee myself watching the show, not even because it provides an ending, which there isn't one in the books. So I wouldn't even watch it for that, because if it's not an ending that the author originally wanted, I don't see a point. Martin is obviously a master writer. To write something like this is a huge feat, and it's a huge success and achievement. And I'm just reviewing as like a plain Jane reader, so I'm not like any literary mastermind or anything. It's just as a person who doesn't read fiction a lot and has not jumped on the train of craziness around the show, this is just my perspective as a new reader. What the books do really well is pull you in the first book, especially with like finding the dire wolves and learning about the Starks and kind of introducing you to all the major players like the Lannisters and things. So it really does a good job of setting it up and pulling you into the story. The major themes I liked were how they deal with impermanence in so many ways, the transience of life. Reading them, it feels like we're gonna see just waves of lives turning over throughout the story, which we do. So if you were reading this about like real historic events, it would just be like one king after another and one court after another and all these battles and things like that. Like, it really does feel like a sweeping historic epic. I think Martin also does a good job of putting you in the place of the people and how much certain things mean at certain points, and then looking back when shit hits the fan later and being like, that actually really wasn't that serious, or I put way too much stock in that thing when I should have been thinking about other things. Really made me think about like what's actually important, and almost like fables telling us, remember to focus on the things that are actually important. So if you haven't read the books, all of these books are written from alternating points of view throughout each story. There are a handful of main characters that Martin focuses on, mainly the Starks, and then he adds in more later. I really like the point of view style, but I think that after the first couple books, it kind of gets a little out of hand. Martin will bring in characters for one scene and then you never hear from them again. It makes it really hard to keep track of the story and who's where, when certain things are happening, because he will tell some points of one event from different points of view, and then he'll bring in a random person who is somewhat related to that event, and it gets a little overwhelming and confusing and difficult to keep track, which is another reason why I was always frustrated with a lot of the bigger fantasy novels like Lord of the Rings, because I felt like there was just so much, and the way it's all written is just like really hard to keep track of, which I didn't feel that way actually reading it, but I do feel that way sometimes with certain points of it. So my favorite characters by far to read were Jon, Arya, Sansa, Jaime, Tyrion obviously, although I became less of a fan of Tyrion as the books went on, but it is interesting to see his character arc. Martin does a good job of showing changes in thinking and in a character arc, not just through their actions, but through their mind. There is one point in the last book where we're dealing with Theon Greyjoy, and he is kind of in this fluid state of who is he and who does he need to be to survive. It was a really good technique to show the mindset of a high value captive trying to survive. Again, because he pulls you in with the Starks in the first book, I felt the most connected to the Starks. And so I just feel like I have waited through all these books for it to come back full circle and really focus on them, and it hasn't. I know that he is supposed to have slated 2 more books, so I wonder if that would be the case if those were finished. I would just hope that it would be, because I feel like the main themes are getting a little bit lost with all of the characters being pulled in. There are a couple moments in mainly the 3rd book, I think, 3rd and 4th maybe. A lot of it is just sad. Trying to, slug through that sadness and grief is just really hard to get to the next thing. Mainly you see that with Catelyn's grief, and then Bran's journey. I feel like Bran's journey past the wall was really sad and difficult, and it just depressed me. So reading those parts, like, I wanted to be more excited about Bran's story, but it was just so hard to read through that journey because it was a little long-winded and just like, ugh. But I guess that is, part and parcel of reading those kinds of things, that you feel that way when you're reading it. You feel like the characters do. So it just felt like it went on for maybe a little bit too long. And then I also kind of, you kind of get tired of people talking about the same things over and over again and thinking the same things. And I know that spiraling, overthinking, focusing on one instance is like human nature. I just think it could have been pared down a little bit. So like Tyrion, after he kills his father, just thinking those things over and over again, I was just like, okay. I think Martin was the most successful with his world building and his descriptions in the first 2 books. So you really got a sense of Winterfell and the Wall and King's Landing and even the Eyrie, the Dothraki Sea, and the Iron Islands too. I felt like those were the most vivid to me. They pulled me in the most, and I felt like I could really see what I was imagining. One of the things I do like to do with fantasy is I think it is useful sometimes to see the movies first, just because it gives you a real sense of what they're trying to portray, and you can kind of imagine the story happening as you've seen it in the show or the movie. I hadn't seen it that much to even do that, so I think he was really successful in building the worlds in the first 2 books. Really difficult for me later to discern between all the different places in the 7 kingdoms and in the Free Islands. Meereen and, Pentos and Bravos and stuff. I really couldn't discern between all of them, especially because all the characters kind of move through those so quickly. And again, with the jumping around in the points of view, it was really difficult to get pulled into one place and really feel and develop that image in my mind. I do think he does a pretty good job of describing the different races and things like that, like the Yunkai and the Miranese and Pentoshi. I think he did a pretty good job because I could kind of pick them out when they would describe people in passing. I think that was successful, but again, the world building was just a little bit lost in all of the character switching. Obviously, these books are pretty huge, consistently pretty much over 1,000 pages. So they are pretty big, so very detailed, a lot goes on. Some of the passages felt a little indulgent to me, I don't really feel like they added a lot to the actual story, and they were just there for color and, maybe for world building. A lot of times I felt like some of these sections I was just trying to get through to get to the next point of action, and they didn't really add anything to the plot or the character development or anything like that. So I think it was kind of like an instance of he couldn't kill his babies, and that's a term if you are a writer. A lot of people will say you need to be willing to kill your babies. So it just means that even though you like a passage and you like what it adds, it doesn't add to the story and it's not very meaningful, so you have to cut it. It just feels like indulgent instances where he wasn't able to kill his babies. One thing Martin did that I thought was interesting was he would have the characters talk about something that happened instead of actually showing that. So the biggest one is the battle in the Whispering Wood where Robb captures Jaime. And I think it was a really interesting thing to do, to have everybody just watch that news travel through the realm instead of actually seeing it happen. It made you feel like you were there in the realm while all this is happening instead of just always being there for all the action. And I liked that because it made it feel more immersive and real to me. There were some times where I'm like, why didn't we see that? Or there would be, we did see it and we're talking about it for multiple for multiple chapters. A lot of the action in the scenes that he did show, the major ones, I thought were done really well. He does a really good job of throwing in twists there very quickly, so it wasn't like there was a lot of foreshadowing or a lot of buildup, or I could call a lot of these twists. I was really taken aback by a lot of them, which I appreciate because I don't like predictability. And I'm also I'm more this way with movies than with books, where I'm trying to call what's gonna happen next. I don't really do that with books. I just kind of enjoy the ride and let it unfold as it will. I actually get more frustrated in books when it's predictable, when I can tell what they're gonna say next without having read ahead. I really get frustrated with that in books. So the fact that Martin keeps us on our toes and keeps it changing constantly was, made it a wonderful read. This is a thing too that happens with adaptations, is that important characters tend to get cut out because they don't advance the story the way Hollywood wants them to. And so you get a whole other layer of characters and plot and just world building in general with the book. So one of the biggest things that they cut for the show, which is I'm upset about, two of my really most favorite characters are Jojen and Mira. They are two kids that end up becoming wards of the Starks throughout the story, and they really help Bran on his journey past the wall, and they're not even in the show. So Having not seen the show, I don't understand what that part looks like if they're not there. And then another thing that I was talking to my husband about is there's a whole section between when Tyrion leaves King's Landing and when he meets Daenerys that is not included and is really interesting to me because you have a whole other character there too with Penny, who is another dwarf who ends up being kind of a big deal in the story, as well as Jorah Mormont. There's a part where the worlds collide there, and that's not in the show at all either. You get a much better sense of the politics between Yunkai and Meereen and how things work in Slaver's Bay and things like that. So all of these things that are cut out for time for the show, you don't get. And I think they are really important to the world building and the plot. Like I said in the beginning, I'm probably not going to watch the show at all. And not even just because I want an ending. I would love an ending to the story and to know like what Martin would have written, because I don't know that the ending in the show is what he would have planned or would have wanted for the characters. So I'm not even gonna watch it. I know that there are supposed to be 2 more books. I don't think we're gonna see them. Which is sad, and I understand why a lot of people are frustrated about that. On A Dance with Dragons, it is ending on cliffhangers that are pretty huge. But at the same time, I'm kind of content to let them lay where they are, and if Martin ends up putting out at least 1 more book, I'll be happy. But I'm also kind of happy as it stands. I have been seeing a lot of articles recently about how he's not making any progress on the next book and how people are upset, and then he's upset with the people and he's like, just leave me alone. As someone who does write, I would feel stagnant having had a ending expedited. Like, I don't know how he felt about the ending. I would feel like, what's the point in writing the next 2 books I had planned if there's already an ending out there? That's the thing about Hollywood, that they just like, you know, barrel through and don't care about the art of it and, you know, the integrity of a story and the integrity of the characters. And this is his life's work, and, you know, he should have been able to end it on his own terms how he wanted it. I don't know if I'll reread these books because they are very lengthy and very heavy. What I thought would be cool now that I've read it through once would be to reread only one person's story from beginning to end. So like reading all of the points of view of Tyrion from beginning to end. I think that would be really interesting to do. At this point, I'm not planning on rereading them. I actually need a break from fantasy now after that. All in all, I really did enjoy the series. I love the world building and the characters, and I think it's a really great series. It was just a little bit hard to get through, not only because they're super long, but because some of the parts are just slow. I felt that way about Lord of the Rings too. Like, some of the descriptions and stuff are a little long-winded. I think I solidly gave most of these books like a 3.5 stars. So overall, I'd give the series about a 4 stars out of 5. My least favorite one was definitely A Storm of Swords, just because a lot of it was like military planning and strategy, and that's just not my gig. My favorite, like most things, is the first one. I love just getting into the world and learning about the characters and seeing how they interact, getting into a little bit of the lore, you know, where they are talking about myths about the others and dragons and stuff. So the first one is probably my favorite. If you are a person who has seen the show, or you're interested in this story but you haven't seen anything or read anything, I would definitely recommend reading these books. I think you get much more of the characters and much more of the plot than you do in the show, even though they have their slow parts and even though they have their difficult parts and it's a lot. I think they're definitely worth it, just because if you love the show, you probably want more of it, and you're gonna get more with the books. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Let me know about the books. Let me know about the show. If you have a good reason I should watch the show all the way through, leave that down below and maybe we will. Leave any of that down below. Leave any recommendations for books I should read. Leave everything down below. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.